In a small American town where the streets were awash in gray winter snow, and the streetlights barely pierced the gloom, lived a boy named Ethan. He was 11, but his thin shoulders and dark, ever-watchful eyes held more worry than childhood. He lived with his grandmother, Martha, in an old house with cracked walls where the wind whistled through the corners and the stove only gave off heat from the rare logs they could afford. Ethan didn't know his parents. Their names were empty to him, like the blank pages in the old books he'd find at the library. His grandmother, bent by age and poverty, worked as a janitor at the local clinic, but her wages were only enough for bread, potatoes, and the electricity bill. They lived a quiet, shadow-like existence. Yet in Ethan's heart, a light burned, and one day it changed everything. A severe winter arrived with a frost that made the window panes creak. Ethan was walking home from school, his boots soaked and his coat, patched in dozens of places, doing little to protect him. He walked along a path by an abandoned lot where rusty trash cans stood like sentinels. There, under a piece of old cardboard, he heard a sound, faint, almost lifeless, like a whisper. Ethan stopped, his breath misting in the frigid air. He knelt down, pushed aside the cardboard, and saw a puppy, skinny with matted, dirty fur and paws covered in a crust of ice. The puppy was shivering. Its deep brown eyes looked up at Ethan as if he were its last hope. Ethan didn't hesitate. He took off his old but warm scarf, wrapped the puppy in it, and held it against his chest. His frozen, red hands trembled as he carried it home. The puppy was light, almost weightless, but its weak spark-like warmth seeped into Ethan's heart. He named him Toby, simply because the name was as soft as his fur. Ethan hid the puppy in the shed behind their house, where old planks and rusty tools were stored. He brought an old blanket he'd found in a closet and his grandmother's old jacket to make a soft bed for Toby. Every morning he shared his breakfast with Toby, a piece of bread, or sometimes an apple he'd brought from school. Toby became his secret, his joy. Ethan talked to him when no one else could hear, telling him about school and his dream of becoming a pilot to see the world from above, where there was no cold or pain. Toby listened, his eyes glistening in the dim light of the shed, his tail wagging slightly as if he understood. "You're my Toby," Ethan would whisper, stroking him, and the puppy would lick his hand. The warmth was like a promise that everything would be all right. Ethan brought him water in an old bowl, cleaned his fur with his fingers, and warmed his paws with his hands, feeling Toby tremble less with each passing day. But his grandmother noticed. She saw Ethan hiding a piece of bread and smelled the scent of a dog on his coat. Her already weary face became stern. "We can barely survive ourselves," she said, her voice heavy like the snow on the roof. "We can't keep a dog, Ethan. We can't afford it." Ethan said nothing. His eyes were full of tears, but he didn't argue. He knew his grandmother was right. Their life was a thin thread ready to snap. But he couldn't leave Toby. The puppy wasn't just a dog. He was his brother, his warmth, his heart. Ethan found a solution. He took his old, battered backpack with holes in the bottom and cut a small opening for air. Every morning he put a warm towel inside, a piece of bread, and carefully wrapped Toby in it, so as not to hurt his weak paws. The puppy looked at him, his eyes full of trust, and Ethan whispered, "Just be quiet, okay?" He carried Toby to school, pressing the backpack against his chest, his heart pounding with fear and love. In class, he placed the backpack under his desk, out of sight, and prayed no one would notice. His grandmother didn't know. She saw Ethan leaving for school, his thin figure disappearing into the morning mist. She'd sigh, her hands calloused by years of work, gripping the rag she used to mop floors. She loved her grandson, but her love was tired, full of the pain of their life. Ethan didn't blame her. He looked at Toby, at his face that was getting a little stronger each day, and thought it was worth living for this. He didn't know how long he could hide the puppy, but he knew he'd never abandon him. Neighbors saw Ethan, his thin frame and the backpack he never let go of. They whispered that the boy was strange, that his grandmother couldn't handle him, but their pity was as distant as the stars. They didn't visit, didn't ask, didn't help. Only Toby was there. He slept in the backpack, his breathing quiet as a whisper. And Ethan smiled, feeling his warmth. "We'll make it, Toby," he'd whisper. And the puppy was his lighthouse in the darkness. One evening, as the frost painted patterns on the windows, Ethan sat in the shed with Toby. He stroked him, telling him how the teacher had praised his drawing of a plane. Toby licked his hand, his tail wagging slightly. Ethan smiled, his heart full. It was an ordinary evening, full of their quiet love. He didn't know that everything was about to be revealed. He didn't know that his secret would become tears and hope. The winter in the town deepened, the cold biting at their fingers, and the snow covering the narrow streets, making them look like forgotten trails. Ethan would get up before dawn, when the house still breathed cold and his grandmother, Martha, was asleep, her breathing heavy with exhaustion. He'd sneak to the stove, warm an old towel on the hot ash, and put it in his backpack so Toby wouldn't freeze. The puppy waited for him in the shed, his brown eyes glistening in the dim light. His weak tail would wag slightly, as if Toby knew Ethan had come for him. Ethan would wrap him in the towel, put a piece of bread or a potato he'd saved from dinner in with him and whisper, "Just be quiet, my good boy." Toby looked at him, his face warm, and Ethan felt the fear recede, replaced by love. The backpack became their secret. It was old, with a worn bottom and holes that Ethan had mended with thread from his grandmother's sewing box. It was heavy, not with books but with Toby's life. Ethan carried it to school, pressing it to his chest, his thin shoulders straining under the weight. He walked quickly, avoiding the neighbors whose stares were full of curiosity but devoid of warmth. In class, he'd put the backpack under his desk, away from curious feet, and sit so he could see it out of the corner of his eye. Toby was as quiet as a shadow. He breathed steadily, his warmth seeping through the fabric, and Ethan felt it like a second heartbeat. The lessons dragged on. Ethan listened to the teacher, but his mind was on Toby. He feared every rustle, every glance from his classmates. One day in math class, Toby let out a weak whimper, barely audible. Ethan froze, his heart pounding and his cheeks flushing. The teacher, Mr. Harrison, a strict man with tired eyes, looked up. "Did someone's stomach just growl?" he said, and the class laughed. Ethan lowered his head, his fingers clutching the edge of his desk, but Toby fell silent, as if he understood he had to be quiet. Ethan exhaled, his eyes moist, but he smiled, feeling the puppy snuggle into the towel inside the backpack. Every day was a test. Ethan would check on the backpack during breaks, unzipping it in a secluded corner of the hallway. He'd look at Toby, at his face that was getting a little plumper, and at his paws that were healing under the rags he'd wrapped them in. "You're doing so well," Ethan would whisper, and Toby would lick his fingers. His tongue was warm like a promise. Ethan would share his lunch with him, an apple or a piece of bread from the school cafeteria. He ate very little. His stomach was used to hunger, but Toby had to live. That was more important. His grandmother suspected nothing. She saw Ethan leaving for school, his thin figure disappearing into the gray morning. She noticed he'd become quieter, that his eyes, always watchful, were now full of something new, a mix of fear and light. "You don't eat enough, Ethan," she'd say, her voice soft but tired. Ethan would nod, hiding his gaze. He couldn't tell her about Toby. He couldn't see the pain of their poverty in her eyes. He knew she was right. They were barely surviving, and a puppy was a luxury they couldn't afford. But Toby wasn't a luxury. He was his brother, his hope, his heart. Neighbors whispered. They saw Ethan, the backpack he never left behind, his quick steps, his thin face. "The boy is strange," said Mrs. Davis, whose house was across the street. "His grandma can't handle him." But their words were as empty as the wind. They didn't come over, didn't ask, didn't offer a loaf of bread. Only Toby was there. He slept in the backpack, his breathing faint but alive. And Ethan felt him like a lighthouse in the night. He'd stroke the backpack when no one was looking and whisper, "We'll make it, Toby." The puppy didn't answer, but his warmth was the response. Ethan lived for these moments. After school, he'd go to a secluded corner of the schoolyard where the snow was untouched and let Toby out. The puppy, still weak, would totter through the snow, his paws sinking but his eyes gleaming. Ethan would laugh, his voice quiet but full of happiness. He'd throw snowballs and Toby would try to catch them, falling into the drifts. These minutes were their freedom, their world where there was no hunger, cold, or fear. "You're my little pilot," Ethan would say, and Toby would look at him, his tail wagging like a propeller. But the fear didn't go away. Ethan knew their secret was as fragile as ice underfoot. He was afraid his classmates would notice, that the teacher would ask, that the backpack would tear. He was afraid his grandmother would find out and Toby would be taken away. Every night as he fell asleep, he'd have dreams where Toby was being taken, and he'd scream, but his voice would be swallowed by the wind. He'd wake up, his heart pounding, and whisper, "I won't let them." Toby slept nearby in the shed, his warmth the only thing that could calm him. The town didn't know their secret, but they could sense that Ethan had changed. Teachers noticed he'd become distracted, yet his drawings of planes, clouds, and wings were full of life. Mr. Harrison, the math teacher, would watch him, his eyes always strict, softening. He saw something familiar in Ethan, a pain he himself had carried as a child. But he didn't ask, no one did. Only Toby knew everything. He was his shadow, his heart, his secret. One evening as the stars pierced through the clouds, Ethan sat with Toby in the shed. He told him how he wanted to fly far away, to a place that was warm and had no winter. Toby looked at him, his eyes full of trust. Ethan stroked him, feeling his fur grow softer. "We'll fly away, Toby," he'd whisper, and the puppy would lick his hand. It was their evening, full of love. Ethan didn't know that their secret was destined to be revealed. The winter in the town held on tight, its cold grip on the streets and the gray sky weighing on their shoulders like a heavy burden. Ethan walked to school, pressing the backpack against his chest. His thin fingers were freezing, but his heart was warmed by the heat of Toby, hidden inside. The puppy was quiet, his faint but steady breathing seeping through the fabric, and Ethan felt it like a pulse of hope. Every morning he'd repeat his ritual. Warm the towel, put in a piece of bread, wrap Toby up, whispering, "Just be quiet, my little pilot." Toby looked at him, his brown eyes full of trust, and Ethan smiled despite the fear that lived inside him like a shadow. School buzzed like a beehive, but for Ethan, it was a maze where every step could be his last. He'd sit at his desk in the corner, put the backpack under his feet, and cover it with his thin coat. The lessons dragged on. Mr. Harrison's voice blended with the noise in his head. Ethan listened, but his thoughts were with Toby, with his still weak paws, with his face that was getting a little stronger thanks to the bread and warmth. He feared every noise, every glance from his classmates, but Toby was his strength. The puppy was silent, as if he understood that their secret was their life. That day started like any other. Math class, the cold classroom, the sound of chalk on the blackboard. Ethan sat there, his fingers nervously fidgeting with the edge of his notebook. Toby was calm. His warmth was comforting, but Ethan still glanced around, checking if anyone was watching. Mr. Harrison, stern and with wrinkles carved by the years, was explaining fractions. His voice was steady, but his tired, deep-set eyes would sometimes rest on Ethan. The boy would lower his head, afraid the teacher would see more than he should. The lesson ended. The bell shattered the silence, and the class erupted in chatter. Ethan gathered his notebooks, his movements quick but careful. He reached for his backpack, but his elbow bumped it, and it fell to the floor with a soft thud. Ethan froze, his heart stopping. He rushed to pick it up, but the backpack moved. Faintly, almost unnoticeably, but it was enough. Mr. Harrison, who was gathering his own papers, turned. His gaze, sharp as a blade, settled on Ethan, on the backpack on his pale face. "Ethan, what's in there?" the teacher asked. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. Ethan stood up, his legs trembling, his hands pressing the backpack to his chest. "Nothing," he whispered, but his voice betrayed him, breaking like a dry twig. The class fell silent, the other students watching, their eyes full of curiosity but lacking pity. Mr. Harrison took a step closer. His steps were heavy like fate itself. "Show me," he said, and there was no anger in his voice, only weariness and something else. A shadow of pain that Ethan didn't understand. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, his eyes full of tears, but he wouldn't let go of the backpack. "Please," he whispered, but the teacher already had his hand out. He took the backpack, his fingers calloused by the years, gently unzipping it. Ethan closed his eyes, his heart screaming, but he couldn't move. The class held its breath, and in that silence a faint rustle was heard. Mr. Harrison opened the backpack, and his face, always severe, wavered. Inside, nestled among the old towel and bread crumbs, lay Toby. Skinny, his fur still matted with dirt, he shivered. His paws, wrapped in rags, were weak but alive. He lifted his head, his brown eyes met the teacher's, and he reached out to him quietly, timidly, as if asking for protection. Mr. Harrison froze. His hand holding the backpack trembled. He slowly knelt down, his face, etched with years, softened, becoming almost childlike. And then he cried. Tears streamed down his cheeks, silent but so heavy that the class gasped. Ethan opened his eyes. His heart tightened. He had expected shouting punishment, but he only saw tears, real tears like the snow outside. Mr. Harrison looked at Toby, and his hand reached out and touched the puppy gently, as if he were afraid of breaking him. "My God," he whispered, his voice hoarse and full of pain. He looked at Ethan, and in his eyes there was no anger, but a profound understanding that made Ethan tremble. "Why didn't you tell me?" the teacher asked, his voice soft, as if he were talking to himself. Ethan was silent, his tears mingling with the dust on his cheeks. He wanted to explain about his grandmother, about the hunger, about Toby, who was his heart. But the words were stuck in his throat. The class watched, their faces confused, but no one was laughing. Toby whimpered softly, almost inaudibly, and it was the only sound that broke the silence. Mr. Harrison stood up, his shoulders slumped but his eyes burning. He held the backpack as if it were a treasure and said, "Everyone back to your seats." His voice was firm but shaky. The class sat down, their whispers gone. Ethan stood there, his hands empty and his heart full of fear. He looked at Toby, at the teacher, and thought this was the end. He didn't know that these tears weren't an end, but a beginning. His love for Toby, so fragile, would become a light for others. Ethan stood in the classroom, his thin shoulders trembling, his tearful eyes following Mr. Harrison, who was holding the backpack. The puppy, weak and shivering, looked at the teacher, his brown eyes like a plea. And that silent trust broke a heart. The class was silent. Their gazes, so recently full of curiosity, were now confused. Mr. Harrison, whose tears had dried but left trails on his severe face, looked at Ethan. "Let's go," he said softly. His voice, usually so firm, was as gentle as snow. They went out into the hall, the teacher carrying the backpack with Toby, and Ethan walked behind him, his steps heavy, as if he were carrying his whole life. He expected punishment, expected Toby to be taken away, expected his secret to become his pain. But Mr. Harrison was silent. His eyes, deep and tired, were full of something Ethan couldn't understand. They entered the teacher's lounge, which smelled of old books and coffee. The teacher carefully placed the backpack on a table, unzipped it slightly, and took Toby out. The puppy, wrapped in the towel, trembled but licked the teacher's hand. And he smiled, for the first time in years it seemed to Ethan. "Tell me," Mr. Harrison said, sitting across from him. His voice not a command but a request. Ethan, whose tears were still flowing, began to talk about Toby, found under the cardboard, about his grandmother who couldn't feed him, about the backpack that had become their sanctuary. His words were disjointed, full of fear, but as sincere as a prayer. He spoke of how he'd warmed Toby, shared bread with him, and how he feared the puppy would be taken away. "He's mine," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. "He's all I have." Mr. Harrison listened, his face impassive, but his eyes glistened as if he saw himself in Ethan, a boy who had once lost his own dog. The teacher stood up, his hands trembling. "I was like you," he said, his voice hoarse. "My dog died when I was 10. I couldn't save him." He fell silent, his gaze falling on Toby, who lay quietly on the table. "But you saved him." Ethan looked at him, his heart clenched. He hadn't expected these words, hadn't expected to be understood. Mr. Harrison placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his palm heavy but warm. "We'll figure something out," he said, and there was a determination in his voice that Ethan had never heard before. Mr. Harrison went to the principal, Mrs. Peterson, a woman with kind but stern eyes. He told her everything. About Ethan, about Toby, about the backpack full of love. Ethan waited outside the door, his heart pounding, his fingers clutching the edge of his coat. He could hear voices but couldn't make out the words. When the door opened, Mrs. Peterson looked at him, her face soft but serious. "You're a brave boy, Ethan," she said, her words like warmth on a cold day. "But this can't go on. Toby needs a home." Ethan paled, his eyes filling with fear, but Mr. Harrison held up a hand. "We'll find a way," he said. He proposed raising help not just for Toby but for Ethan and his grandmother. Mrs. Peterson nodded, her eyes glistening. "A school should be a family," she said, her voice full of conviction. They gathered the teachers and told them about Toby, about the boy who carried him in his backpack to save him. The teachers listened, their faces, tired from work, softening. Some remembered their own dogs. Others remembered their own poverty. Some were silent, but their eyes were full of tears. The school came alive. Teachers brought old blankets, bags of dog food, and medicine for Toby that they found in their homes. Students' parents, after hearing from their children, brought jars of oats, warm clothes, and even an old dog kennel from their garage. The children, the very ones who had laughed at Ethan, now looked at him differently. They drew pictures of Toby, brought him pieces of bread, and whispered that he was a hero. Ethan watched it all, his heart full, but he was afraid to believe it. He held Toby, stroked him, and the puppy licked his hand, his eyes like stars. Mr. Harrison went to see his grandmother, Martha. He spoke with her for a long time, his voice gentle but firm. He told her about Toby, about Ethan, about the school that wanted to help. Martha wept, her hands, calloused by the years, trembling. "I didn't mean to be cruel," she whispered. "I was just so afraid for him." Mr. Harrison nodded, his eyes full of understanding. "Toby needs Ethan," he said, "and we'll make sure he stays." He suggested calling Toby the school mascot. Not officially, but it gave him the right to be there. Martha looked at him, her tears bitter, but there was hope in them. Ethan found out that evening. He was sitting in the shed, his fingers stroking the puppy, when his grandmother called him. She hugged him, her embrace weak but warm. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. Ethan cried, his tears falling on Toby's fur, but he smiled. He knew Toby would stay. He knew that his love, so fragile, had won. But he didn't know that their story was just beginning. That Toby would become something more than a puppy in a backpack. Ethan walked to school, his steps light, and his backpack, now empty of its secret, swung from his shoulder. Beside him, Toby trotted along, his fur still sparse but clean, gleaming in the sun. The puppy, saved from the cold, was stronger. His paws, healed thanks to the medicine, walked with confidence. Toby looked up at Ethan, his brown eyes full of joy, and Ethan smiled, feeling his heart, once constricted by fear, now beating freely. The school had changed. Its walls, once permeated by the winter cold, now held warmth. Toby became a part of it. His small figure running through the yard was like a spark, bringing smiles to faces. He no longer hid in a backpack. Every morning, Ethan brought him to class, where Toby would lie by the window on an old blanket given to him by the teachers. The children would surround him, their once indifferent hands now stroking him, their voices calling, "Toby boy." He'd look at them, his tail wagging like a propeller, and even those who had laughed at Ethan were now his friends. On the classroom board hung a tag that read, "Toby the School Pilot," drawn by his classmate Lena. It was her idea to give Toby the name Ethan had whispered to him in the shed. The tag was just cardboard, but to Ethan it was worth more than a medal. He looked at it, his eyes glistening, and thought that Toby wasn't just a dog but his wings, his dream, his heart. Mr. Harrison, whose stern features were now softened by a smile, would say, "Toby teaches us what's most important, kindness." His words, simple but as heavy as truth, were repeated at every meeting, and the teachers would nod, their eyes full of light. Ethan had changed. His thin face, once pale from hunger, was now rosy, and his ever-watchful eyes glowed. He ate more. The teachers brought him lunch, calling it a school ration. And his grandmother, Martha, her shoulders now straightened with help, cooked soups with the oats given by the parents. Toby had become their family. In the evenings, Ethan would sit with him in the yard talking about airplanes, about the sky, about how they'd fly away to a place with no winter. Toby would listen, his face warm, and his tail would beat against the ground like a drum. His grandmother, Martha, would watch them from the window, her hands, calloused by the years, clutching a handkerchief. She'd cry, but her tears were tears of light. "You saved him, Ethan," she'd say, her voice trembling with pride. She saw Toby running in the yard, saw Ethan laughing, and felt that their life, once a thin thread, was now as strong as a rope. The school helped. They brought firewood, clothes, even paint for the house. The neighbors, whose whispers had once been so sharp, now came over, their faces apologetic but sincere. They'd bring milk for Toby, apples for Ethan, and their words, as simple as bread, were like an apology. Mr. Harrison would come to their house, bringing books about airplanes he found at the library and telling Ethan about the sky. "You're going to be a pilot," he'd say, his voice as firm as faith itself. Ethan would look at him, his heart beating faster, and he believed. The teacher would look at Toby, at his gleaming fur, and smile. "He was my lesson," he'd say, and his eyes, once so tired, were now full of life. He remembered his own dog, his own pain, and knew that Toby was his redemption. The town talked about Toby. His story, which began in a backpack, became a legend, but not one that is forgotten. Children drew him on the school walls, their chalk leaving marks like stars. Parents, their hearts softened, learned to be kinder. Teachers, whose days were full of worries, found time for Ethan, for Toby, for each other. The school became a family, and Toby was its heart. He'd run through the hallways, his bark lively and bright, spreading like a song, and people would smile, feeling that their world had become brighter. One day in May, as the sun warmed the earth, Ethan sat with Toby in the schoolyard. He looked at the sky where clouds drifted like airplanes and whispered, "We'll fly away, Toby." The puppy licked his hand, and his eyes were a lighthouse. Ethan smiled, his heart full. He knew that their love, so fragile at the beginning, had become stronger than winter, stronger than fear, stronger than loneliness. Toby wasn't just a dog. He was their miracle, their truth, their hope.